All right, welcome everybody. Why don't we get started? Today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Saori Katada from the University of Southern California. Before we begin, I'd like to read land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'd also like to, by way of advertisement, mention an event that we will be running on December 2nd in memory of Okamoto Yukio, who was a good friend of ours who passed away recently due to COVID-19. And this panel will feature moderator Deanna Horton, our very own, and panelists Michael Green, Richard Samuels, and Tadokoro Masayuki. That'll be on December 2nd. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. And finally, the way you can ask questions during this session is through the built-in Q&A feature on Zoom. And you should feel free to submit questions at any time. They won't be disruptive to the presentation. And if you cannot figure out how to use the Q&A feature, you can also email csgj.monk@utoronto.ca. So we look forward to receiving your questions. Our speaker today, Professor Saori N. Katada, is Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. She is the author of numerous books, including Banking on Stability, Japan and the Cross-Pacific Dynamics of International Financial Crisis Management in 2001. She's co-author of the BRICS and Collective Financial Statecraft in 2017, and Taming Japan's Deflation, the Debate Over Unconventional Monetary Policy in 2018, as well as many other books, articles, and chapters that are excellent across the board. She's the winner of numerous prestigious awards, including the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Foundation Book Award and the Abe Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council. She joins us today to talk about her most recent book, Japan's New Regional Reality, Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia Pacific, published just this July from Columbia University Press, so very much hot off the press. It is an important and impressive book, in my view, that explains how Japan's international economic engagement has evolved in recent years and how the country has continued to exert leadership despite changing regional realities and global turbulence. As our colleague Bill Grimes from Boston University aptly writes, this book provides the best guide to Japan's contemporary foreign economic policy available today. And I wholeheartedly endorse that idea. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Saori Katada. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil. Such a kind and generous introduction, and things will go downhill from here. So I'm very honored to be here. So I would like to first thank the Center for Study of Global Japan, and Mio and Phil helped me a lot in getting this started. I'm very excited to be here and talk about my book, especially talk about this in the context of what's going on in the last, well, less than a week. So if you don't mind my sharing the screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So let me start talking about what's exciting about what's going on in the last week or so is this. You probably heard or saw it on the news or read it on the newspaper where the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement just concluded and signed by the 50 members. That this is the member of 10 ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Unfortunately, India kind of checked out and left this negotiation last year. But this is a big deal which covers 1/3 of global GDP, as well as 1/3 of global trade overall. And this was one of the 3 mega FTAs which Japan concluded in the last 3 years. One, obviously, you probably know, CPTPP, which Canada is already also a part, and the other one is Japan-EU Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect in February of 2019. So, at the time when the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership of 11 members concluded in March of 2018, this was the headline from the Wall Street Journal, basically talking about the fact that, Japan, which used to be, if you are, some of you might be too young to remember, but Japan used to be a major villain in the context of global free trade, especially with getting into a major conflict with the United States, and from the 70s, even 80s into the middle of the 90s. Now, Japan is leading this free trade agreement with a very high standard and very kind of a stringent fixed commitment to liberalize and put high standard liberal order in the trade and investment kind of agreement. So that's the kind of backdrop as to why I'm very excited to talk about my book. Here it is. I like the cover, actually. This is a book just came out in July 2020. I have been looking at this issue for quite a while now, and I'm kind of I feel very fortunate that this book came out at this timing because of many delays that I have had working on this book. But, especially after this book came out, Prime Minister Abe resigned, and new Prime Minister Suga just stepped in. And in some ways, this kind of be a way to really take a stock of how far Japan has come since in the last about 25 years, where there has been a significant tectonic shift taking place in the political economy of the Asia Pacific. So let me go talk about this. Basic agenda for today is to talk about how Japan has become the savior of this liberal economic order in Asia Pacific. And obviously, given our President Trump, who I hope will step down in a couple of months, the kind of wariness of how this international liberal economic order could continue in the world, and especially in the Asia Pacific, is a major concern. In that context, Japan has gotten quite significant highlights. So I would like to talk about how it has come to be, and also why this kind of a way in which Japanese geoeconomic strategy shifted over the course of last quarter century. And finally, in this context of talk, I would like to talk about the opportunities and challenges that Japanese government's new geoeconomic strategy has moving forward. Even though this is a clear trend, clear direction that Japanese government is pursuing, while there are still quite a few challenges. So I would like to wrap up that way. So my argument overall is the fact that Japanese government's liberal turn has started as this country, Japan, became the mature economy in the 21st century. There are many elements of becoming mature economy, both in terms of its positioning around the region and the world, but also their government business relationship, as well as kind of institutional setting within Japan. But in that context, obviously, the rise of China is very important and crucial. And this basically shifted the power balance between Japan and China, as well as China and the United States, which propel Japan to take this rule-setting strategy, geoeconomic strategy, in the context of the Asia-Pacific political economy. And at the same time, it's not only the regional or global context that triggered Japan's move, but it has to do with domestic political economic structure that has been transforming over the course of last 25, 30 years, seriously, that kind of created paths towards this geoeconomic strategy. But the path for certain issue areas. I will cover that in a minute. Issue areas would be guided by the specific institutional structure that's underpin those issue areas. So I'll get there in a minute. So first, let me talk about how things have evolved. So Japan's regional geoeconomic strategy, and start with the definition. So geoeconomic strategy may be the term that you haven't heard as much. I think it's becoming quite common kind of a lingo in international relations, especially international political economy. But it examines the use of economic instruments by governments in pursuit of national goals as they cultivate economic and political advantages such as economic growth, competitiveness, and sustainability. And for Japan, this economic strategy, the goal is to secure the regional economic environment favorable to Japan. So Japan over in a kind of a broader sense, not only the government, but the private sector businesses and so on and so forth. So my argument is that strategy itself shifted quite a bit, quite drastically in the last 25 years or so, quite a century, from the old style of taking a bilateral route, informal, no rules, and led by embedded mercantilism, Japanese businesses pursuing its narrow business interest and try to expand market and so on, to the new strategy, which I call state-led liberal strategy, especially since the late 1990s. It depends on the issues, so I'll go there in a minute, but since around late 1990s, where the way they kind of look at their structure is regional. So institution building within the region is quite a priority for the Japanese government. Also, it uses the formal rules with the pursuit of liberal and global high standard. I look at 3 issue areas, and this is the kind of overall table. One issue area is trade and investment. And as I said earlier, that the paths are quite diverse in getting to that overall kind of a liberal turn. And so in the kind of structure, in terms of structure, so this is moving from bilateral to regional, engagement from using the formal rules of engagement, which is moving from the formal rules to informal informal rules to formal rules, and then underlying values from more embedded mercantilism of the kind of pursuit of narrow national interest to have kind of more liberal standards. And so I covered trade, investment, money and finance, and development and foreign aid. Since I don't have that much time, I would like to specifically talk more about the trade and investment. But this is, as you can see, so M means medium, kind of medium progress. High means H means high progress, while L is still low progress in these areas of shifting from the old style to the new. The one that I talk about today is on the trade and investment, which really kind of made a major progress, and I would like to focus on that. Obviously, I'll be happy to. I'll cover a little bit of the second 2 other issue areas, but I'll be happy to talk about that in Q&A if you would like. So looking at trade and investment, this is chapter 5. This is the issue area where this liberal turn on the part of the Japanese government's geoeconomic strategy took, I would call, a gradual path. So in the late 1990s even, so 1997 to be precise, Japan was still sticking to this old style of avoiding formal agreement and trying to shy away from the liberal high standard of trade liberalization and investment rules. The story of the APEC is quite revealing. And again, this took place in 1997, where the APEC members, which are the 21 members around the Asia Pacific, including the United States and Russia and most of all the Asian economies, tried to agree on the kind of a formal liberalization standard in the form of early voluntary sectoral liberalization, EVSL. Japan was the one which really digged the heels in and kind of made this agreement go away. Really, it was Japan's torpedoing this really kind of shows how even in the context of APEC, which Japan was one of the leaders in establishing, Japan was still quite stringently against these formal rules to be the guiding principle of regional political economy. While now, as the new strategy sets in, Japan is now keen on, first of all, agreeing bilateral economic partnership agreement, then going to China-Japan-Korea Investment Treaty, which is quite aspirating in 2012, and also now in 2020, the agreement of RCEP. This was, all of those are formal rule-based investment trade order. And now the liberal standards are adapted quite significantly in these agreements, such as the TPP, which is known to be the gold standard or platinum standard of trade agreement among those members. While obviously another one that was a big one is the Japan EU EPA. Even though RCEP, we can talk about RCEP more later, but RCEP is known to be not as kind of high standard, but it houses quite a bit of the investment and trade standard, which is very beneficial for the businesses. So this is this is a kind of overall coverage of Japan's economic partnership agreement. Japan tend to call it EPA rather than FTA. It's the way that Japan wants to express its own preference in terms of what contains FTA, EPA. And currently, so starting with the small members, like small partners like Singapore and Mexico, Malaysia, and so on, starting around early 2002 was the first one with Singapore, and then from there forward, it has expanded from those that only covers like 12%, 30% of Japan's overall trade around the world. Now it covers, so this covers 75% after the conclusion of RCEP. By the way, so this is Japanese Ministry of Economy and Trade and Investment publishes this map every year. This came from the white paper of last year. Unfortunately, this year, by some reason, they are slow in translating. So I only had the Japanese version, so I'm sorry, this is 1 year old. But this basically shows you how much coverage Japan has already obtained via free trade agreement or EPA, economic partnership agreement, and quite aggressively engaging in it. And again, now covering more than 75% of its trade. One of the reasons why the number here is higher is that India obviously dropped out from RCEP, and I think there are few differences from this table and overall. And however you see this, Japan's really the shining moment came at the time of CPTPP. So TPP itself, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, was negotiated from 2010 forward. And Japan was a very reluctant, even then, quite a reluctant participant or the last negotiating member to join in. Since 2010, Japanese government was talking about it. Prime Minister Kan at that point from DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, were already mentioning the prospect of Japan joining. But those who follow Japan would know there was a major backlash and very kind of a difficult domestic negotiation to put TPP to get started in joining TPP negotiation. Finally, under Prime Minister Abe, who came into the office in December of 2012, Japan managed to join TPP negotiation so started to propose it in March 2013 and then allowed to join in July in that year to become the 12th and last member of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this is again, the platinum standard free trade agreement with almost 100% of liberalization as the goal. And that means Japan's protection of the agriculture and so on would be very difficult to do. But still, with this multi-year negotiation in 2015 October, they managed to agree on the TPP, and February of 2016, all the 12 members, again, some of them on the west side of the Pacific, some of them on the east side of the Pacific, managed to sign. And that was the timing when there was a US presidential election, and Trump, who got elected in November of 2016, said no to TPP and made it his one of the first orders of business to withdraw US from the TPP. While then, after a few months of kind of scrambling, Japan, as well as some countries like Australia, New Zealand, and so on, kind of took the lead to make this TPP 11 among the remaining members to the table, and actually managed to agree with some chapters which US really tried to push for, kind of being frozen in the kind of new CPTPP. So altogether, this was one indication. Some people, some of the kind of long Japan watchers talk about, this is the first time Japan really left its own shell of US occupation and took its own independent initiative. And that was, one way to really kind of save the international liberal order, which has been so long protected by the United States. So altogether, that indicates this, kind of a major shift of from the old strategy to new strategy through kind of looking at these evolution of Japanese trade and investment policies from the 1990s onto the current. And again, RCEP is another one that Japan has taken a significant lead on it. The other issue areas, one is the monetary and finance. I looked at the currency issues as well as kind of a regional financial corporations such as the Chiang Initiative. So in some of the cases, when it comes to the regional arrangement or having the regional setting, and especially the one that does not include the United States, this is really most advanced in this area. Meanwhile, some parts of the effort that Japan wanted to take, such as the currency, the kind of regional currency arrangement, didn't really pan out at all. So I call this this issue area, the path of this issue area, uneven. Some of them are quite advanced, but others are not there yet. But at the same time, establishment of Chiang Initiative and its institution associated with it, the AMRO, ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office, is really a major achievement. And that's where Japan and China actually see eye to eye and really collaborate quite closely. And this is a topic Philip works on too. So then the other area that I looked at is the foreign aid and development, where the path is quite hybrid at this point. Since Japan used foreign aid as an instrument of engagement for a long time in East Asia, that bilateral path continues to be the main way to deal with this. So the institutions exist, the regional institutions exist, such as Asian Development Bank, but it's still it's a more of a country-to-country program. Sometimes trying to engage private sector, that's the public-private partnership, PPP, is still somewhat difficult for the Japanese government to engage. At the same time, though, Japan is now implementing more of the formal rules, high standard rules, following the OECD. This is the member of rich countries, headquarters in Paris. They have kind of a group called DAC, Development Assistance Committee, where they set the rules, and Japan follows these rules quite stringently. And also now in the contest between the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative promoted by China, which focuses very strongly on the infrastructure investment. Japan is now the champion of the quality infrastructure investment, where back last year in G20 Osaka Summit, the G20 members, which actually includes China, agreed on the principles of the quality infrastructure investment to say that, yes, it's important that infrastructure investment takes place, but it has to have a high quality, protecting kind of social environmental impact, looking at the debt sustainability, thinking about the life cycle cost of investment, not just a cheap investment that kind of gets built and then breaks down at immediate future. All those things were what Japan kind of promotes as a part of a higher standard that these government has to keep. So having talked about how this evolved over time, talk about why or how this came to be. One is obviously the economic power shift. However one cuts it, Japan is now working, kind of looking at a slow, at least relative decline within the region. This was the GDP of Japan and China, as well as the rest of East Asia, kind of looked at as 100%. Japan used to capture about 65% of GDP. Now it captures half of that, while the remaining part was captured by China now. So for Japan to survive in this environment, Japan need to have some rules put in place in the region, institution built as a way to kind of control the regional environment, more in favorable to Japan. And also during this period, obviously, the regional economic integration proceeded quite significantly, and that makes the region more important for Japan's own economic viability and growth. And when it comes to the comparison with the United States, obviously U.S. it has been relative. U.S. decline or relative decline is not as stark in the context of Asia Pacific probably, but this kind of introduced the competition between U.S. and China when it comes to the kind of a rule-based order, and created this geoeconomic rivalry between the two. So US pushes for market liberalization, economic security, as well as rule-based order. So these are the kind of ways in which US prefers to put these rules in place within the region and globally, while China has different take on the way that the kind of economic environment that benefit them through state capitalism, use of more economic coercion, neomercantilism, and then so on and so forth. And in this context, I argue that Japan serves as I would call pivotal state. In terms of kind of shifting the rules of the game, Japan can kind of put its weight in this competition to kind of adjudicate or to kind of influence heavily what kind of rules get adopted in the region. So my note about Japan being a pivotal state is not that it has the kind of shift balance between US and China quite easily and flexibly. It's much more to do with the rule setting kind of a pivotal state, where if Japan kind of tilts on certain rules, it is much likely for that rules to prevail given this kind of geoeconomic rivalry between the two countries, the United States and then China. But in order to kind of pull this off, the domestic transformation has to be in place, that Japan could move and be proactively engaged in geoeconomic strategy and need to do so. And there are three elements that I discuss here. One is the shift, again, over the course of the last 25 years or so, of the balance between the private sector and public sector, that the government is now not the leading entity to guide private sector, but private sector has much stronger kind of independence from the government. And so this becomes more arm's length, kind of this embedded relationship. Those who studied Japan back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s would obviously remember the developmental state kind of discussion. There's kind of no clear conclusion, I don't think, but still, I'm arguing at this point now that after 25 years of that, Japan's height of its might, Japanese government is now kind of go with what private sector would demand rather than kind of guiding the private sector in a certain way. Also, part of the disembedding the private sector is that many of the private sector, the big businesses, especially not the kind of smaller businesses, but big businesses are now more of an investor than an exporter. The overseas production of Japanese companies have expanded quite significantly. By now, almost in manufacturing sectors, almost 60–70% of the production are done overseas, especially within the region. So this is where supply chains or regional production network, all these production kind of spread apart kind of within the region really becomes important. Given the kind of Japan's demographic shift, Japan's kind of expensive labor costs, all those have made Japanese large firms to operate all over the region, which would continue to make many of the Japanese firms competitive, but makes the regional rule setting quite crucial altogether. And finally, third point is when it comes to the implementation kind of institution, it is important to note that there has been quite a few institutional reform within Japan that made the political leaders and the kind of more centralized power in the hands of the Prime Minister's office. This kind of gradually shifted over time from the 1990s to now. And this is the kind of survey of who has the power of policymaking conducted by Muramatsu and his colleagues, basically talking about political party being, becoming more and more important compared to the bureaucracy. In the past, the bureaucracy had quite significant power, and fragmentation among the bureaucracy kind of made it difficult for Japanese leadership to take a proactive lead. But given the changes, one in 1994 of the electoral reform, 2001 of the administrative reform, that's where the power of the Prime Minister's office got enhanced by restructuring the ministries and then, so on, that the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet Secretariat can have more policy-making power, which was utilized by Koizumi, Prime Minister Koizumi first, and then Prime Minister Abe, especially after 2012. And then also in 2014, there was a reform on the civil service where Prime Minister and his office would have much stronger influence in determining the promotion and the kind of decision of the personnel matters in the bureaucracy. So altogether, this was a way in which Prime Minister's office could have power kind of congregated among, kind of tapping into the bureaucracy to have more proactive geostrategy or economic strategy rather than kind of being fragmentedly implemented by the ministers, which was the case actually of the earlier days of the Economic Partnership Agreement, where 4 ministries have to agree on certain areas, on all of the issues, and certain areas really create major conflict. This was the METI, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Agriculture. So that was demolished, and now, especially things like TPP, it's the Prime Minister's office which has the TPP task force or headquarters and implement the policy. So I would like to conclude with the implications. Those who are studying international relations, some theoretical implications I would like to note. I take seriously the systemic domestic nexus, where systemic pressure kind of gets kind of resonate and then make kind of work with the domestic structure to produce certain policies. And so I look at both sides to kind of determine the path that the Japanese government is taking. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a very, this is another step forward, not in this book necessarily fully fleshed out, but it's interesting to see how developmental state matures and becomes this liberal state, even though there are some remnants of the state in Japan, which I'll get to in the last conclusion, but there are, this is the kind of course of action that advanced state, even with the history of developmental state strategies taken in the past, kind of grows up to be. And also, I think this has a significant implication looking at regionalism and competitive rule diffusion as Japan has become the pivotal state within this game. So finally, I would like to close by saying the opportunities. So for Japan, there's a significant opportunity as, again, Japan as a pivotal state, where there's a rise of geoeconomic strategies, rivalries, and use of economic statecraft. Obviously, I don't touch much on the security issues, but some of these economic strategies are now kind of incorporated in comprehensive security and many other aspects of how a nation strive to survive and thrive. And also, as I noted, the mature development state as a strategic actor will be a kind of a opportunity for Japan. Japan went through from the catch-up economy to late industrializers to become one of the advanced nations. That experience itself is create a bridge and a kind of added advantage for Japan to negotiate between the advanced nations, which demand high standard and stringent liberal rules, to the ones which are trying to become like these nations, but still need to protect its economy and use other measures to grow faster or kind of advance its technology. So in some ways, RCEP is the kind of typical way in which Japan negotiated and mediated between the more advanced nations and less advanced ones to provide forum where many of those countries at a different level of development, different ways of develop, can kind of work together. Meanwhile, challenges also exist, where Japanese government, however cut it is, has a very limited financial resources, and it has some still remaining bureaucratic fragmentation. It is ideal if Japanese government can actually tap into the private sector financing, private sector funding, but it's still difficult for Japan to entice the Japanese businesses' behavior. So PPP, the public-private partnership, would be ideal thing Japan to implement, but it has been quite difficult to really succeed at it. At the same time, at the end, I would like to say Japan still has this kind of DNA of kind of a developmental state and then certain protectionist kind of attitude. And sometimes when China behaves exactly kind of similarly to that, Japan reacts to kind of come back to its own root. And that's observed in the infrastructure investment. But my argument is basically, yes, part of that is true, but also Japan is now implementing the higher standard to be beneficial to the region and the rest of the world. So I would like to stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very clear and concise presentation. I know it's always difficult to summarize a book in a brief presentation, but I think you really pulled it off nicely. So I really appreciate that. So we have several questions from our audience members. So I'd like to just jump right in for the sake of time.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And so one question comes from Professor Michael Donnelly, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto.
Yes.
From the Japanese private sector viewpoint, how does RCEP differ from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? How significant is RCEP from your scholarly perspective? If possible, can you estimate how many Japanese affiliated firms in the various member nations will be part of or affected by the new RCEP agreement?
Okay, well, thank you. And good morning to you, Professor Donnelly. It's been a while, I saw you. But I guess there are two parts of the question. RCEP is different from TPP in various ways, but I think especially the attraction of RCEP is that it covers a significant kind of ground in Western Pacific. Yes, unfortunately that India was not part of it, but it covers everyone except for Taiwan, I have to say, but everyone in this region. And that's been the favorite or the priority for the METI, which oversees all the industrial kind of kind of issues for Japan, because it's Japan's regional production network would be covered by RCEP pretty much throughout. So the way their rules of origin is set is to accommodate this supply chain and production network around the region, so that they don't have to pay any additional tariffs on the production that's taking place, from Malaysia to Thailand and then to the Philippines, and then maybe some parts coming from China and things like that. So for many of this regional production, RCEP is quite significant. Meanwhile, TPP, even though it's much higher standard, things like kind of a what do you call it, the labor protection or environment or rules against the state-owned enterprises and so on are in TPP but not in RCEP. But TPP only covers few countries. Even if everybody signs, they haven't signed. Not everybody has ratified yet. Sorry, not signed, but ratified yet. But Thailand is not in TPP. Malaysia hasn't signed, and Indonesia is not in TPP. So this doesn't really cover the regional production network. So I think that's the really important part of what RCEP managed to achieve. In addition, Japan has actually free trade agreement with everybody in the RCEP except China and South Korea. And obviously with many reasons, these three countries that were actually trying to negotiate their trilateral agreement, they did that on the investment side, but not on the free trade agreement. So this is really significant. Now Japan has access to China. I think 89%, I believe, if I remember the number correctly, 89% of the industrial goods are now tariff-free entering in China. And China had about 10 to 12% on, of tariffs on many of those goods. So it would be significant for the industries, given China's large market, and obviously some with Korea too. China is the largest trade partner to Japan. Korea is the third largest trade partner. And finally, the impact of RCEP, the calculation that I've seen, this is just very recent. Obviously all the text, I don't know how many pages it is. It must be 10,000. Really crazy amount of document has just been published. But the calculation so far is that it will push Japanese GDP by 5%. I think over the course of 10 years or 20, I can't remember, 10 years or 20 years. So it is quite significant. Obviously, yes, it would be nice that India would be in it, and it would be nice if there'll be a way to kind of make RCEP rules kind of getting higher to come to the standard of TPP. They have 5-year interval of reforming or redefining some of these rules. So my expectation and kind of my thinking is that they'll be upgraded kind of each 5-year interval. So I don't know if I answered the entire question, but that's the kind of RCEP versus TPP.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Bob MacArthur, who notes that this was a delightfully crisp and clear presentation, a delight. So that's a positive comment. And in terms of the question, given China's aggressive assault on the international liberal order, can one really call any agreement like RCEP an agreement that supports a high standard liberal order? To use your words, isn't China the quote unquote villain here, replicating the key features of the old style Japanese trade and investment strategy?
Yeah, well, okay, good question. I think I would like to kind of respond to that in two ways. One, yes, maybe true that China has used its market power, economic power, and the kind of connection between the government and all the businesses in certain way that probably that would definitely in violation of the kind of rules of international liberal order, like subsidies and state-owned enterprises and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, China thrived because of international economic order, and it's very aware of it. It has no intention of my take on it is it has no intention of dismantling the international liberal order in a fundamental way. Obviously changing it to its favor probably is what what China prefers. So that's my one first take on it. The second take in terms of RCEP is that even though I think in many journalistic take on the RCEP, they call it this a China-led initiative. But I don't really agree on that. Actually, the history of RCEP is in such a way that this was the configuration that Japan preferred, while China didn't want Australia, New Zealand, or India to be part of it. And I'm sure China didn't want this level of high standard to be part of the RCEP either. There were some compromise made to China, like state-owned enterprise issues not in the RCEP agreement, or the source code sharing was not banned in RCEP where TPP is banned. There are a few of those things that's true. Meanwhile, the reason why China got onto RCEP and also at this point really made this happen is because China is still really worried about being put outside of this international liberal order, especially facing U.S. Very kind of strong attack against China, decoupling, and maybe changes of supply chains because of COVID and various other things. So now China actually accelerated and became much more favorable to conclude RCEP now, and with some compromise in the rules and stuff like that. And the way the other members, including Japan, is seeing this is that, yes, true, maybe it's not as high standards as TPP, but it's much better than not having standard. There are compromise on the part of China, such as China used to require, investors in China to have certain performance criteria, or all that. That's already banned and stuff like that. So China is now compromising with these rules to abide by these rules because it's so worried about being excluded or being marginalized in the context of kind of a free trade and kind of an economic integration within the region and beyond. So I would say RCEP is quite a bit of a large step forward in changing China from within in many ways by using the free market, the kind of open market as a enticement for China to really say, okay, we will try to abide by these rules and be kind of good faith player in this order. Maybe if it's not, it's very high standard, but still in that, in this region. Again, yes, obviously from here forward, how some countries can cheat and how can all the rules that are agreed upon can be enforced and so on will be a question. But RCEP is thinking, RCEP is actually planning to have a secretariat. I don't know where it's going to be, but secretariat to really oversee all these the progress and improvements and kind of how do you call it? In terms of who's abiding by the rules and so on moving forward. So again, long answer to the question is yes, true that China has some have violated many rules and it's concerning, and yes, it will put it will throw its weight around, but at the same time this open market, this free trade, this kind of a global economy, the connectivity, all that is of interest to China too.
Great. I have a set of questions from students who are in my class on Japanese foreign relations, Carla Muya and Thatcha Manivasagan. And I think it relates largely to where does Canada fit into Japan's geoeconomic strategy? And so why should Canada prioritize cooperation with Japan rather than essentially faster growing Asian economies like Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam? Essentially, what is Japan's comparative advantage? And what are some of the areas of post-pandemic cooperation between Japan and Canada that look promising in your view?
Yeah, well, I should have studied a little bit about Japan-Canada relations, as I knew that this is the talking Canada. I'm sorry, that's not the, I haven't really done that thoroughly, but so Canada actually was one of the difficult player in the CPTPP agreement. You might remember, some of you might, who followed might remember, because Canada wanted much more of certain protection. I think there were some issues with kind of domestic politics, Ontario, and all that kind of stuff. But overall, though, I think this kind of rule setting, rule-based regional order is very much of the interest to Canada, and especially under Trump, with the renegotiation of NAFTA, which now MCA is kind of has made Canada approach, made it a bit more difficult for Canada to approach China fully. So that's one thing. And then there was this kind of a no market economy kind of clause where it kind of makes it difficult for Canada to approach China directly. So that's second. And in that case, Japan can be kind of a bridge between the two. In terms of your question, in terms of the student's question about other fast-growing economies, yes, true. Indonesia is, Indonesia or even India is growing faster. While again, when it comes to rule setting, Japan is definitely the forerunner of it within the region. And also, even at this point, Japan is the third largest economy. Yes, probably be overtaken by others pretty soon. So, I'm not arguing that Canada should collaborate only with Japan or Japan at the expense of other countries. But I think overall, Japan is kind of in some ways a like-minded country to Canada, like-minded country, in the context of the regional cooperation. So that will be my response. And I'm sorry, I don't know much about U.S.-Canada relationship.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Probably a better person to answer that question.
I have a question from Anna Kiriva of Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Dear Professor Katada, many thanks for your presentation and a fantastic book. How would you describe Japan's geoeconomic strategy in the growing China-US competition, given Japan's economic ties to China? Does it represent a kind of balancing act? And do you believe it is efficient enough?
Yeah, so despite the fact that I mentioned that Japan had the independent policy from the United States at the time of CPTPP, US is still a very influential actor to Japan. So some of the kind of priorities the Japanese government is taking in relation to the regional global economy is influenced by the US. And in some ways, some of the Japanese leadership kind of prefers Trump's tactics because it's really very, very strongly, kind of pushing against China, right? So, in some ways, Japan got influenced by that in the sense of, economic security and kind of set up the security division within the National Security Secretariat. All these things kind of relate to the G5 issues, many of the tensions that US is having vis-a-vis China. And in some ways, it kind of provides Japan a good platform to kind of move on that agenda. Meanwhile, as what's her name? I think I've met her as the person.
Anna Kiriva.
Yeah, Anna Kiriva. Yes, Anna was saying that Japan's integration, Japan's stake in China is very, very high. There is no way at this point, in the near future, of decoupling Japan from China. And even the government trying to shift the supply chain from away from China into other regions, I think it's very difficult for private sector to really, ditch the 1.4 billion, kind of population and kind of move away from the kind of established effort of production and all that from China. So altogether, my general take from kind of from my work on the book and all that is that it's important to integrate China in the system that would tie China in various ways by using the open market around the world as a way to entice them to really abide by the rules as much as Japan can have any leverage to do so. Hopefully the kind of, again, conclusion of RCEP and the US change in administration kind of makes this a bit easier to really push this kind of agenda forward. So that's my take. Having said that, I think Japanese leadership at this kind of is mixed about how to address this issue. Obviously, yes, decoupling US-China is very undesirable prospect for Japan, while many are kind of welcoming that kind of pressure on China, because now the Japanese leadership feels, some of them feels that it's very difficult to control China's behavior without a major stick behind it. So I think, and I'm sorry, I have a mixed response to it, but my take is these rules-based order is important, and Japan pushing for that is maybe not as kind of splashy strategy, but very important.
Oh, great. So unfortunately, we are just about at the end of our time, but I just wanted to note that about an hour ago, the Nikkei reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping had announced that China would give positive consideration to potentially joining the CPTPP. So this is obviously a very interesting and exciting area. I won't ask you a question about that since we're out of time and you probably haven't thought about it, given that it was just announced. But thank you very much for a very engaging and thoughtful presentation and Q&A session. I learned a lot, and I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of the audience members when I say that this was a really very educational and wonderful presentation. And so I'd like to thank Professor Katada, as well as the staff of the Center for the Study of Global Japan and the Monk School for a great seminar. And I'll give you, Professor Katada, the final word.
Oh, no, just thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. And, I hope we have more dialogue. This is an exciting area. So I hope we can engage more dialogue moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.